But first, Ukraine's president is in Paris today. Volodymyr Zelensky in the French capital for the latest edition of the Coalition of the Willing Summit, co-hosted by the French president and the British Prime Minister. The meeting comes after Donald Trump's deadline for Vladimir Putin to meet Ukraine's president came and went. Kyiv is expecting security guarantees from its allies here in Europe as the war drags on and Russia's advances on the battlefield continue. James Vecina reports.
Back in Paris and back to the conference table. Leaders from across Europe are set to join Volodymyr Zelensky and Emmanuel Macron either in person or by video call in Paris this Thursday. That will be the case for Donald Trump, who'll be phoning in from the United States. And the matter at hand will be to determine what security guarantees these countries are prepared to provide to Ukraine, should the war come to an end after a peace treaty is signed with Russia.
We expect tomorrow or soon after tomorrow to have clarity on what collectively we can deliver. If a bilateral or trilateral meeting would start to happen with the Russians, particularly between Zelensky and Putin, clearly having clarity on the security guarantees is extremely important.
For now, the details of these guarantees are extremely confidential, according to the French president. And for Ukraine, clear wording will be key as it seeks to avoid past mistakes like the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which failed to protect the country's sovereignty.
Ukraine, unfortunately, has this very bitter experience, very bitter past when it comes to security guarantees and negotiations on that and documents proving them. Ukraine needs real security guarantees, which are robust, which are really effective, which are working, which are not assurances, they are real security guarantees. And obviously we don't need Budapest number 2.
The Budapest Memorandum was meant to see Russia respect Ukraine's border in exchange for its nuclear disarmament and was signed by the United States and the United Kingdom. Speaking in China on Wednesday, Vladimir Putin suggested a meeting with Zelensky in Moscow, but Kyiv called this an unacceptable proposal.
We can now bring in John Lough, Head of Foreign Policy at the New Eurasian Strategies Center. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on the program today. Are the Americans now on the same page as the Europeans when it comes to how to bring this war to an end, given that Donald Trump's new deadline for Vladimir Putin to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky has essentially come and gone?
Well, to some extent they are, because I think President Trump is realizing that President Putin isn't willing to play his game, that he has no interest in bringing this war to an end anytime soon, because he believes he can win the war. So he's been going through the motions of suggesting that peace talks are possible. But when he talks about peace, what he really means is the subjugation of Ukraine. Because for him, a peace settlement will come about when Ukraine is defeated or when it's about to recognize that it will be defeated. So to that extent, I think that there's a sobering up on the US side, a realization that what they believed they were told by the Russians was not in fact true. And we're sort of back to square one. So the Europeans have been skeptical all the time about what Putin is saying and his commitment to any sort of peace process. So they're rightly trying to put in place some sort of structure that when we get to that point, when peace talks take place, that Putin realizes that, in fact, Ukraine still has very considerable support and that he's not going to be able to, for example, simply to demilitarize Ukraine and to deprive it of its sovereignty and independence. So in some ways, the Europeans are getting a little bit ahead of themselves here in talking about, how things might look on the ground after the signing of a peace agreement.
Because that is what I was going to ask you. Are the Europeans essentially going ahead and putting the cart before the horse, given that we haven't brought this war to a close, yet they're thinking about the day after? Should they not be putting more eggs in the diplomatic basket in terms of bringing this war to an end?
Well, it depends what you mean by the diplomatic basket.
I mean, fly to Moscow and talk to Vladimir Putin, because they tried to go to Washington to reach the Russian president, but that's in the other direction, effectively.
if you look at it this way, if the US president can't achieve a result with the Russians, then the Europeans certainly can't. The most important thing they can do at the moment is to bolster Ukraine's defenses, in particular its air defenses, because the country is coming under increasing attack. We're seeing numbers of civilians losing their lives. A big attack on Kiev last week, 25 people killed, an attack on Odessa last night. These attacks are increasing despite the fact that Putin has been in talks with Trump about, some sort of potential peace arrangement. So at the moment, I think you're absolutely right. The Europeans, to some extent, are getting ahead of themselves, because if they are to get to the sort of peace deal that they envisage, Ukraine has to keep fighting, and it has to be supported in that process.
Let's talk about the security guarantees, because the details are scant, but if, for instance, that the Europeans announce some sort of boots on the ground type situation in Ukraine, this is not going to be palatable for the Russians. And again, we're back to square one.
Yeah, the boots on the ground, in my view at the moment, are a fantasy, because the Russians have made this plain from the very outset that they would never accept this. So the only way they could be made to accept this would be for them to accept that they can't defeat Ukraine, that the cost of fighting the war is greater than they would like, and that they should be then persuaded to stop as soon as possible. But we're very far from that point, and Putin has invested so much effort in this war that I believe he feels he has a chance to win it, and he's determined to win it.
I want to ask you something else, because the US has poured cold water over the notion of Ukraine joining NATO. Yet we have NATO Secretary General, we have Britain's Prime Minister, even the EU Commission President, who sort of keeps talking about Ukraine someday joining NATO or its place being in NATO. If European leaders all decide to take this off the table, could we not potentially go ahead and actually achieve peace and bring this war to an end, which continues to this day? As you said, Russia continues to bombard and is gaining ground on the battlefield.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Russians are advancing, but they know full well that there is no chance of Ukraine joining NATO anytime soon. The fact that President Trump seems to agree with them that there's no need for Ukraine to join NATO is very significant. NATO is a consensus organization, and without its biggest contributor, the United States, there is, of course, absolutely no way that this is going to get over the line. So the Russians know that full well. What was interesting in Putin's remarks from Beijing yesterday was that he seemed to indicate that Russia now has no objections to Ukraine joining the European Union. Now, that certainly wasn't the case in 2014, and in fact was the trigger for the annexation of Crimea. So to what extent the position has really changed there is unclear. Whether Putin really means this, of course, is another thing, because he is regularly untruthful when it comes to the issue of Ukraine. So we'll just have to see how the Russian position develops over the coming weeks and months if Ukraine can stay in the fight. Putin seems to believe that Ukraine can be defeated rapidly.
There were some reports that the Americans were growing frustrated with the Europeans because the Americans felt that the Europeans were not being helpful in a diplomatic solution or trying to bring this war to an end based on just the rhetoric coming out of Europe. What do you think of that?
Well, I can understand that there are probably some people in the United States who just want to see a quick end to this war at any cost, who would see that the Europeans are being difficult, that the United States has spent a vast amount of money on this war, and in their view to no great effect, and could have done better things with it. But I would say at the same time, in Congress in Washington, there is still strong support for Ukraine. Within the Republican Party, I believe still there is significant commitment to the need to support Ukraine for the security of Europe, because the security of Europe affects the United States. So I don't believe that President Trump is going to sell Ukraine down the river. But I can understand that he wants to see rapid progress, and he's done everything possible to suggest to Putin that this is the time to settle. I'm not going to use any hard instruments against you. I'm not going to impose sanctions. I'm doing everything possible to make it easy for you to agree to some sort of peace deal. But despite having said that to Putin, Putin hasn't really taken him up yet on the offer. So that suggests to me that Putin feels that he can still get much more out of this war, and that is simply by forcing the Ukrainians and the European allies to recognize there is no alternative to this Russian version of peace in Ukraine.
John Lough, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on the programme today.